Hi, Core 3. Before we get into this week's lecture, I'm actually in New York at the moment, and I went to the Met Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art here, which houses an extensive collection of art and artifacts from across the globe. And I noticed that they had an exhibition here that's been open since October 19th through May of this year called Pictures Revisited. And this is, we can quickly, I left a link here in Canvas for you to look at um, this web portal to the exhibition yourself, because they have exhibition objects and then descriptions about the objects that are in the exhibition. But I did want to just read you the exhibition overview, because this is again revisiting their pictures generation exhibition from 2009. And that was last week's lecture, was on pictures generation artists. So a deep dive into the Met's rich collection of contemporary photography, Pictures Revisited reassesses the legacy of visual appropriation at the museum and beyond. The images in the show are snippets from magazines, staged or copied outright from other artworks. Like the works in this exhibition, the show itself is a sort of remix on the occasion of the museum's 150th anniversary. It provocatively expands and reimagines the Met's landmark 2009 exhibition, The Pictures Generation 1974 to 1984. The first major museum initiative to trace the evolution of visual appropriation through a network of practitioners, including Sherry Levine, Richard Prince, and Sarah Charlesworth. Drawing equally from pop culture and art history, the artists manipulated familiar photographs, ads, logos, and tropes, decontextualizing and reusing this imagery to upend traditional notions of authorship. Responding to a media landscape ever more saturated with images, they reached a conclusion which in our digital age seems obvious. Where pictures once documented reality, they now replace it. More than a decade later, Pictures Revisited situates their work in an expanded field. Of the tightly knit group of American artists who formed the first Pictures generation, 5 are represented here. They appear alongside key predecessors and contemporaries, as well as artists for whom Pictures' approach was critical influence. This exhibition considers the many legacies of appropriation, manifest at times in collage and archival projects, and in theatrically staged photographs that test the limits of cliche. Seen together, these strategies suggest an antidote to the anxiety of influence, that fear that there's nothing new under the sun. In a world increasingly mediated by images, perhaps there's no such thing as an original picture. I wanted to read this to you because I think that this exhibition overview really describes well some of the themes and ideas I was trying to present as far as what's at stake or what is being called to our attention within the act of appropriation. Let's go to the exhibition objects here quickly. And we see, it'll pop up here in a second. The first object that they have is the Cindy Sherman film still. And if you click on a lot of these objects, you'll see a little description about this object and then in relation to the series in which it was created. So between 1977 and 1980, Sherman photographed herself in a series of 67 scenarios staged to suggest the cinematic tropes of mid-century Hollywood. Here she assumes the guise of the Hitchcockian career girl, alone in the streets of the big city. Sherman accentuates the dramatic artifice of her pictures, emphasizing those elements of production that often go unnoticed. Camera angles, lighting, costumes, and backgrounds all come to the fore, triggering the stock narrative and characters from which our own identities are composed. And then it shows you object details. And so this is a great little portal. And if you want to, they have 38 objects or works of art that are exhibited in this exhibition. And here's one by Richard Prince. And so you can go through, and if you still have questions about the validity or the power or the necessity of pictures generation as a movement, and particularly questions about authorship and reappropriation, this might be a good portal and a good way to understand it better. And there's also more contemporary. We'll look at some Hank Willis Thomas today, actually, but there's more contemporary works in here as well. So they're recalling with this exhibition, they're thinking about that the original theme of that first exhibition, pictures generation, and now they're re-looking at their collection and they're bringing new objects into the conversation. Okay, so without further ado, we'll jump into this week's lecture. And we are transitioning now into a project using Photoshop. And so I want to introduce you to artists that are thinking about collage and photo montage more historically and then in a contemporary sense. Because what's so powerful about Photoshop is not only the ability to digitally manipulate one photograph, but that we work in layers in order to combine photographs and images together. And then we can also use filters and things to highly manipulate them. So that's the project that we're transitioning to. And so to set a precedent and a body of work for you to consider, let's go back in time and look at the work of Man Ray to begin. Our first two artists, Man Ray and Hannah Hoch, are both Dadaists. And if you don't know about the Dada movement, it's a movement of the early 20th century in Europe. And it was a cultural response to the absurdity of the War of World War I. If you remember the history of World War I, it was fought on a very kind of flimsy and weak premise, and many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people died. So after World War I and the crazy violence and destruction of World War I, artists responded by creating nonsensical or pushing the limits of what was kind of socially acceptable. And so they wanted to kind of shock. They were really interested in shocking their audience. They created things, for example, like word salads, which were poems that were completely nonsensical. So in a world that seemed to be made of no sense, they also were pushing the limits of what was sensical and nonsensical. And this is really one of the first movements that pushes us into modernism. I'm not an art historian, so I can't give you too much background. I think the most famous and influential Dadaist is Marcel Duchamp. And hopefully you learn about Dadaism and Marcel Duchamp extensively in your art history classes. I hope you are. So not only are they kind of revolting against these traditional values that and a kind of world turned upside down, but they're also responding to the rise of mass media, print and cinema. So this is again in the early 20th century. And so we have magazine publications and now the cinema. And so then we're able to now create mass-produced mass media. So the masses, media that can be distributed and consumed by masses of people that then end up, like we've seen last week, defining culture without the masses really evaluating what's going on. We kind of get wrapped up in it. And this is just the way popular culture kind of functions. So Man Ray is from Paris, France. He's not only a Dadaist, but he's also associated with Surrealism. And what we're looking at, he worked across multiple mediums, but we're going to look at his rayographs today. And his rayographs are images that were created by placing objects directly onto photosensitized paper without the use of a camera. So this is not a new technique, but they're notable because his combinations are irrational, and they really start to push and emphasize abstraction. He said of these, "I've finally freed myself from the sticky medium of paint, and I'm working directly with light itself." So basically, by putting these on photosensitive paper, exposing it to light with these objects on, and then developing the paper itself. So we're not creating a negative and then taking that negative and blowing it up onto a photosensitized paper. Here, he's just placing objects directly on it. And so you can see we can understand these from kind of we can analyze them as abstract compositions and see the kind of dynamic shapes and forms that they create. We can also start to imagine what these objects are here. This looks kind of like a slinky, perhaps, I'm not sure. And then maybe a glass, right? And so the glass and the way it's refracting light, something propping up the glass. So anywhere, and there's this really interesting inversion happening where the objects that are the most opaque and heavy become like the lightest and brightest objects, and the ones that are more transparent, because where the light is hitting the paper, it becomes black. This is kind of beautiful. This is a 35mm film strip that he's laid on top of this photosensitized paper. And then some other objects that are a little discernible to me, but you have this repeating circular form. And then we can start to try to read the images that are in the film strip itself. This is calling back to film, the cinema's relationship to traditional photographic practices. Here's another combination. And again, we're thinking about things that are representational and abstract, and the friction caused by those two, and creating a dynamic composition. Because when we're working with Photoshop, we're really thinking about, we should be thinking about 2D compositional elements, what makes a strong 2D composition. And I think that these can give us a kind of clue into what makes a strong composition, where your eye is moving around and there's points of interest at various places on the 2D work of art. Here there's some kind of mannequin, but it kind of is reminiscent of some kind of character, maybe holding these sticks in the air. And you, of course, can read into these because they're abstract. There's many, many readings. So you can kind of imagine or develop your own narrative content when looking at these pieces. Almost looks like letters. The object at the bottom looks like it's trying to, letters strung together. There's a feather, and then some other objects. But the shape and the movement of those objects placed together is interesting. I quite like this. There's panes of glass that have been propped up and something in the center. But it does create a sense of movement. The panes of glass themselves look like they could be objects that photographs have been developed onto. And we see a kind of image on one of those planes of glass. So using materials and techniques that are reminiscent of film and the cinema and cinematography, he's using those, but using that directly with this very direct method of putting them directly onto photosensitized paper and working directly with light as a medium. This could be cutout paper, perhaps, that's just spiraled and laid on top. One thing to note is that all of his compositions are really contained within the frame. I don't think any of the objects are, maybe with this one, they're coming off the frame, but most of them are contained within the frame, which I think was a conscious decision on his part. This looks like that same little wooden mannequin, and maybe a bridge to a violin, perhaps. This is quite beautiful to me because the feather you can see the pattern on the feather, that the light coming through the feather recreates its patterning. And then there's some matches and other objects. Okay, so next we'll talk about Hannah Hoch. And she was part of the Berlin Dada group. And The Dada group was really dominated by male voices, but she really developed, she's known for her collage and photo montage technique that she developed, where she appropriated and recombined images and text from mass media. And her purpose was to critique popular culture in the Weimar Republic, specifically the concept of the new woman. And the new woman was an ideal that was being sold through advertising as an energetic professional, kind of equal to man. And this is happening, I think, in the States as well, this idea of the new woman, you know, liberated from long dresses and bob haircut and knees showing and things, that there's a kind of, what she's doing is critiquing the way that that idea is being sold to us, I think, through her combining of images. So she reappropriated images directly from magazine content. And I think she was one of the first artists to really do this, to collage in this style. And here you can really see this idea of woman being questioned, where we have the cutlery, we have this kind of crown on her head of cutlery that's been removed. We have an African mask, part of it covering part of her face, and the mask, I think, had to do with a fertility goddess, perhaps. And then this is over another a famous German film starlet. So we're really thinking about the combination, so the images and what's symbolic about the images as they're brought together and combined into one image. Here she's taking multiple faces and combining them into something that's exaggerated, highly exaggerated facial features. And I think a lot of what she's referencing is probably more recognizable, you know, if you were living in Germany at that time. So it's probably richer in its content and some of the critique or symbolism that she's trying to construct here. But we have this female face. I can see very clearly we have this female face, and it's centered. She's smiling, and it's dividing this very stern old man's face. Then there's some other images of people that are decorating his collar. Russian Dancer, this is called, 1928. You can see at the bottom. So how to distort the body, thinking about gender representations in mass media, and then how to appropriate those images and then recombine them in a way that calls attention to the way that the body is used to construct identity and gender. Some of these are pretty low quality pixelated images. I apologize. You know, it questions our sense of beauty and aesthetics and the female form, and what's kind of gendered norms and what's considered beauty norms. Okay, we're going to move ahead now to America, and this is Barbara Kruger. She's a pictures generation artist, and her style is pretty, she works in the same style throughout her career, and she is also appropriating advertising images, and she makes them black and white, and then she adds this very, this kind of Helvetica bold font on top that's in red and white. So we have a very graphic and confrontational image that does force us to confront our relationship to images as they are sold to us through advertising. And her work is pretty didactic. So it doesn't leave a lot open to interpretation. It really, it's kind of an affront, and it says what it means. So your body is a battleground, and a female's face, and this kind of inversion that happens, this divide, this inversion, this kind of black and white thing happening. And then the statement that says advertising is making your body a kind of a place for conflict. This is one of her most famous. I shop, therefore I am. And it's funny because a lot of brands now, I think there's a couple brands that adopt this visual aesthetic as part of their whatever they're selling. I don't know. There's a company called Supreme, I think, who's appropriated images. So, but this I shop, therefore I am on a business card. There's not a lot open to interpretation with this type of image. It tells you exactly the message that she's trying to convey in the combination of text and image together. This one is maybe a little more ambiguous, thinking of you. And there's this pin poking the hand. So the pin, again, thinking about fashion and garments, but also it's sharp and could prick you, and thinking of you. So this could be an advertisement, this text on top of it. So perhaps there's this layering of meaning that, or a kind of tongue-in-cheek or sarcastic, cynical expression, thinking of you, but really, I'm not thinking of you. I'm thinking about how I can kind of use you or something. I'm not sure. Okay, next we're going to move on to Martha Rosler, who's an American artist and another American artist. She's best known, she works across media as well. She's best known for a film she created, I think, when she was in her graduate program called Semiotics of the Kitchen, which is from 1975. But we're going to look at a series called Bringing the War Home. And this is a series that she's done. She's continued this series a number of times and has a number of iterations. And so what she combines are magazine images of American domestic life, and then she combines those with images of different conflicts and war zones that Americans are involved in. And particularly with the Iraq War, she was really interested in this, the invisibility of it in our daily lives, and how and that seemed to be really problematic to her, and so she wanted to show us. So she's bringing attention to that by combining these two sets of disparate images into one image. You get the sense that she's really highly critical of the way that we turn our backs to the conflict that we are so heavily engaged in the destruction. So this is a pretty clear image. This woman holding back a curtain and the conflict outside her window. So these are really aggressive images, but combining photographs from war zones and then photographs from advertising, I think her message is quite clear about priorities and value and attention and national values, pop culture values. What do we value as a culture? What are we engaged in as a culture? So it's a big time cultural critique. So what I want to show you with these images is that this is a really, I think, clearly defined set of conceptual parameters for her project. And it's something that I would really highly suggest you work on developing in this project, bringing together two separate sets of ideas and combining them to say a message. I think if you maybe work with that, or you can work with the kind of ambiguity of form and texture and shape and things like those rayographs. There are many directions you can take, but this is a really great example of really clear-cut guidelines on working with this set of images, and then reconstructing what seemed to be realistic, physical spaces, I think, with Martha Rosler's work, which is really masterfully done. Hannah Hoch's work, this sense of scale, and they're almost cubist, right? They look like they kind of they are a little bit ahead of their time before Cubism, and Picasso's kind of recreating the body from all angles and creating these kind of monstrous forms. But here, this is kind of representational realistic space, even though the images are quite jarring and are from two separate parts of the world and two separate sets of images. But again, the kind of ambivalence or luxury in which we surround ourselves with in order to remain ignorant of the kind of cost and the toll. This is a really bad pixelated image, but I think it's powerful. This is just what I pulled from the internet. You see the conflict outside, but then you see a soldier whose leg's been amputated, and George W. Bush and someone else, I don't know who that is, kind of embracing, watching and laughing. I mean, it's pretty clear kind of political critique in this work. Okay, next I want to introduce you to Hank Willis Thomas, who I showed was part of that Pictures Generation exhibition at the Met. And Hank Willis Thomas was born in Plainfield, New Jersey, and he lives and works in Brooklyn. He holds a BFA. He's a contemporary artist. And this is the first artist that's using digital collage techniques or digitally manipulating the image. The others have been collages so far of different types. So this is the first that's really a digital photo montage. So he holds a BFA from NYU and an MFA from Cal Arts. And this could be, I think, this type of photograph probably started out, I'm only going to presume that it started out from a studio session, and with these two figures. Could be two figures or it could be one figure and shot twice and then combined. Hard to tell. But you have these two figures that that then the photograph has been manipulated to really highly contrast these ideas of black versus white or black and white. But they're combined together. And so you can question, his work was really thinking about race and speaking directly about race and identity. And then the way that it functions in mass media as well, with images like this. So the way that brands, he's really interested in brands as a kind of modern, the relationships between brands, athletics, the male body, and questions of ownership of that black body. And again, tying to the history of slavery in the United States. So he has a series like this of chains with sports equipment. And you see this, I think what's most important about this image is the shoe with the Nike symbol. So I don't believe that he's actually photographed this particular set of scenario. You know, he's collaging together, but it makes it look like a very realistic scene. And then he's isolating those image elements and putting it on a black background, those are all conscious decisions he's making. Thinking about black bodies, ownership, slavery, pretty clear in this image, where this football player is confronting the past, cotton picker. Because I think like the NFL, the way that the NFL drafts its players and the way that they evaluate the bodies of their players, the way that the players have now more, but still not enough protection against injury and can be easily disposed of and replaced. Those kind of things. That legacy is really related, and he sees it being related to slavery. Some of the practices just recall it a little too clearly to him. Here's one again about ownership and branding and how brands own us. So he's branded. Here we have the Nike logo branded to the skull, and here branded on the body. And so these are all created, again, digitally manipulated photographs. And this image has quite a story to it. I'll let you look at it for a second. So this is a photograph he took from during his cousin's funeral. And his cousin was murdered outside of a nightclub because his friend was wearing a gold chain that somebody wanted. So there's no other reason for his death other than that attempted robbery. And so he's taking this advertising form from MasterCard, which we're all really familiar with, this priceless thing. But he's appropriating that and then shining a completely, he's using it in a completely opposite way than how MasterCard usually uses this, which is to sell us on ideas of what is really priceless. So again, this is dealing with race and dealing with income inequality and things like that. I felt that this was interesting. This was a bit of a quote from the Brooklyn Rail. So this was printed large and posted outside of a Birmingham Museum of Art. And it caused quite a controversy because a lot of the residents, as they were going by, thought it was actually a MasterCard ad. And they were really appalled. There was a journalist that kind of broke the story on this ad from MasterCard that seemed to be disparaging Black families in a way, and that it was a highly racist ad, but it wasn't an ad. It was made by Hank Willis Thomas. And so I think that this is a really interesting to talk about in relationship to our discussion on appropriation. However, this is from the Brooklyn Rail, a quote. However, although Thomas's artwork displays powerful critiques, they also run the risk of falling within a legal gray area. Here lies a curious irony. According to the Supreme Court, artistic expression is entitled to the highest possible First Amendment protection, equivalent in power and protection to that of the purest political speech. Yet, the picture suddenly changes when brands literally enter the fray. While the law normally protects the freedom of individuals to speak and express themselves, those freedoms can often stop short when they conflict with the intellectual property rights of others, particularly where brands are concerned. So this is called Priceless #1. And that branded head from 2003. This is from 2004. And branded head displayed appropriated logos. Those companies might argue that these works lead consumers into thinking that the works are officially sponsored by the company, confusing the public as a result. And even when court judgments reflect strong protections for artistic freedom, those pronouncements rarely find their way into the army of cease and desist letters some artists receive after appropriating a company's brand. So that sheds light on some of the legal gray area that we have when dealing with appropriated images, or in this case, appropriated brands. All right, so we're going to jump to a completely, we're going to really kind of pivot into an orbit into a kind of commercial photography world with David LaChapelle, whose work, he's a commercial photographer for sure. So he works to generate fantasy images of elite pop stars. But I think his work is really artfully done, and it could really excite you on the potential possibilities of using Photoshop. So these are some definitely consumerism images that are selling us on luxury and wealth and the power of of our pop culture icons. But they are poppy themselves. They're extremely highly saturated, and they're full of images and objects. So we'll just kind of look at these, and you can see, and these were made quite a while ago, but you can get a sense of, some of the possibilities of like how highly manipulated you can manipulate your images in Photoshop. So he's taking these of celebrities, and then he's kind of collaging, photo montaging digitally different scenes of opulence and excess. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these are actual sets. But then I'm sure they're highly digitally altered and fixed and retouched as well. Like the sense of lighting and mood is highly filtered. And then these are some of his kind of more artistic productions. And this image is really highly pixelated, so again, I apologize about that, but you can get a sense of just how far you can push the imaginative kind of fantasy, romanticized aspects of digital manipulation in photography with these images. So these are like fashion photography. This is pretty high fashion photography. I don't know where they've appeared. I don't know what magazines they've appeared in or anything. There's David Bowie. And I think we'll end it with that one. Okay, so that's it for this week. You can move on in the module. We have a Photoshop tutorial to get us started for our next project.